because inside these concrete and stone walls, they'll decide the future of people with disabilities. They will decide if we have the right to live free out in the community, in our own homes, where we choose and how we choose. And they'll decide that for all people with disabilities. And we've come tonight and we're going to light a candle, each one of us. It's a candle of hope that justice continues to reign in this country, that the freedom that is afforded everyone else under the Declaration of Independence and civil rights is afforded to people with disabilities.
All right.
Welcome to Focus on Abilities, a program about issues affecting the lives of people with disabilities. I'm Lex Frieden, your host, and we're here live today from the White House in Washington, D.C. for a very special edition of Focus on Abilities. Through the courtesy of the Houston Municipal Channel and ILRU, the Independent Living Research Utilization Program at TIRR, we've brought our cameras to the old Executive Office building right next to the White House. Bit of trivia that we want to ask a question before we start here, and we'll give you the answer before the end of the program, in fact right away. Who was the first individual with a disability to occupy a role in the President's staff as the point person for disability outreach? Well, the answer to that question, sitting right next to me, is Jonathan Young, from the Office of Public Liaison, Outreach Person, Disability Community. Jonathan, thanks for being our guest on Focus on Abilities today.
Well, thanks, Lex. It's a pleasure to join you again. I enjoyed our first program together in Houston.
We also have with us today the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Planning Evaluation in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Mr. Bob Williams. Bob was appointed by the President, and Bob and Jonathan together are going to share some views about issues pertaining to independent living by people with disabilities, as well as some issues pertaining to personal assistance services and the role of research in the disability community. So Bob, welcome to Focus on Abilities. All right. Jonathan, we've talked before about history, and you are an historian. Being in the White House here, it seems appropriate to ask you about the role that history ought to play in the disability movement. Now, we have a relatively young movement, but don't we have lessons from history that can help us move forward with our movement?
Absolutely. I do wear another hat as a PhD candidate in American history at the University of North Carolina, and history really does inform my daily activities here at the White House, and also I think really does stand to help in incredible ways the broader disability community. I think it's really important when you look at any type of social policy or social reform to keep in mind of where you've come from. I think it's awfully easy to get so caught up in the present, and one of the things that disability history teaches us is that disability shares a lot in common with other civil rights movements, that disability really isn't entirely separate and different from and unique from other types of social policy, that it shares a lot in common with the struggle for African American equality, women's equality, gay and lesbian equality. And I think it's helpful to remember that because there's a lot of strength that can be drawn in learning from the lessons that other groups have had in their reforms and to join with them in a common struggle. And I think it's really important for people with disabilities, especially the younger generation, including myself, to take note of the past, to remember that persons such as yourself and Bob have a grasp of how different things were years ago, and that we need to remember the struggles that you have gone through and how much you have paved the way for people now to continue.
I guess it's also important for us to realize that from the standpoint that we've been involved with the ADA, from the standpoint that many of us are in roles that people with disabilities might not have imagined themselves or others being involved in the past, we are a part of history. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Part of history that we're both benefiting from the accomplishments of the past and constantly shaping our own future.
So it's true that historians deal not only with the past, but also with the future.
Yes, certainly. And one of the ways that I find history particularly beneficial to me in writing about the history of the Americans with Disabilities Act and trying to get a sense of all the different aspects of what makes for constructive, positive reform, having a good grasp of how the ADA came about really helps me as I'm now working in the White House, working, for example, with the Work Incentives Improvement Act, that it helps me to see and be mindful of what things we need to be aware of as making mistakes of the past and what examples to follow.
Now, Jonathan, in 1985, we had some hearings. The National Council on Disability, when I was in Washington, had some hearings about the importance of a civil rights law for people with disabilities. And I'll talk with Bob about that in a minute. But in 1985, did you have a disability?
Actually, no. In 1985, I was, I would have been a sophomore in high school, devoting pretty much the entirety of my life to wrestling.
So at that point in time, when we were just conceiving the ADA, it was the furthest thing from your mind. You could...
Pretty much. I mean, the real first introduction I had to disability in any concrete way actually was just a number of weeks before I had my spinal cord injury at Walt Whitman High School, not far from here in Bethesda. I don't know exactly what the event was, but they brought in a whole bunch of people with disabilities to come and meet with different classrooms. There was a basketball tournament playing against different athletes who got destroyed, of course, by the wheelchair athletes. And they talked about how life goes on and how productive life can be. And little did I know at that point that I'd soon be there myself. But certainly, like you said, I was not thinking about disability rights in any way.
But your experience with that, I think, is instructive to our colleagues who have the opportunity from time to time to help educate young people about disability and to help them understand it shouldn't be feared, it needs to be lived with. And now we're making improvements in the environment and the social structure and in our laws that actually help people with disabilities be productive. Bob, I recall at that hearing that the National Council on Disability had in 1985 that you came to speak there. And at that time, you weren't a government official. As a matter of fact, as I recall, you may have actually been living in a nursing home or some other kind of supportive environment at that point, or you had shortly before that. Is that accurate?
At the time, I believe I was just out of college and my first job was as a court monitor overseeing the closing of an institution.
That's right.
Called Forest Haven.
Yeah, it's ironic to some degree that you were advocating at that time opportunities for people to live in the community. And as I recall your remarks, that was one of your hopes, that a law like ADA would help people with disabilities have more opportunities to be independent, to live in the community. Now you are, to some degree, responsible for helping to analyze policy and recommend policy and produce policy that's intended to provide people all over the United States with those opportunities. It's obviously not an easy thing to do because we have a history in this country of providing institutional alternatives for people, and when we don't make the same investment in providing alternatives in the community for people with disabilities. Do you believe that in the future we have the hope of a breakthrough? Do you think that in the foreseeable future people with disabilities will be able to have real choice?
I think that a number of states are certainly moving, hopefully, in that direction, and as both the President, Vice President, and Secretary Shalala point out, states have tremendous flexibility, even within the current Medicaid program to increase home and community-based services. The challenge is to find ways they can do that while still controlling costs.
May we infer from your answer then that one very real opportunity for our colleagues in the disability movement, for people with disabilities, family members, advocates, public officials, is to better use the flexibility that's built into the state-federal program now and to work within their states to help improve those programs that are already possible to develop at the state level?
I think that is key. The disability and aging communities, together with the states, as well as the federal government, need to roll up our sleeves and out, how, best, to, make, current law, work, in this regard.
But Bob, you wouldn't deny that the disability community should also continue to work with the federal government to try and provide more incentives and encouragement to the state in that process, right?
Particularly in terms of increased technical assistance and the like.
Okay. Well, I'm sure that many of us are going to be working with you in that regard. Jonathan, in terms of breakthroughs, like in the area of personal assistance services and others, the future for people with disabilities in this country, I mean, in the last 10 years, we've had incredible progress following the ADA. We've had progress at the state level, at the local level, and clearly in the federal level. There are places in this city, places in this White House that I can get to today that none of us could have gotten to 10 years ago before the passage of the ADA. We've raised a lot of consciousness, sensitized a lot of people, and made a lot of progress. Do you think that we're at a plateau now, or what areas do you see the potential for real progress in the near future?
I wouldn't say a plateau at all. In fact, having written a lot about the history of the ADA, you do hear a lot of doomsayers who say that, well, you know, the ADA really hasn't done much of anything. And I think that's wrong. We have made tremendous progress. I think it is important to remember that in many respects, the ADA was very forward-looking. It didn't rule that you had to retrofit everything immediately at that point. Our society continually and persistently, as new buildings get constructed, as places are renovated, it is going to become increasingly accessible. And I think we're also seeing, you've alluded to some of the media images, an incredible change in the way people in our society view disability. You know, one recent example, Charles Schwab has a commercial with a blind person, and you can hear his text-to-speech operating, and you can see his refreshable braille working. And really, in so many ways, I think we're really taking off. In just the last several months, an incredible level of press attention to some major initiatives. The Work Incentives Improvement Act that's been very active. We have a long-term care proposal on the table that would, among other things, provide working people with disabilities opportunities to provide for portions of their personal assistance services. Bob was working on an attempt to try to level the playing field between nursing homes and community-based services under the caps in terms of coming under Medicaid. The president and vice president, from their beginning of their campaign, have held the principles of independence and inclusion and empowerment as their goals for the disability community. And I think we're really making tremendous strides. And with the ADA 10th anniversary coming up next year, I think that's really an opportunity to remember, act, and move forward.
Let me ask you a question. You mentioned that the administration has made an effort to include people with disabilities to better integrate disability perspective. And I suppose to a lot of people, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric that gets thrown around in Washington by politicians and public officials. And so the real question, me to you, is sitting here in this White House, is integration as it relates to public officials and particularly the leaders of the country? Is it really something they've learned to say that sounds good and they use it at the right time and bring people with disabilities to the front of the line when there's a press event or something? Or does it really go deeper than that? Does it actually get into the small conference rooms like we're in today when the domestic policy is discussing issues of national interest and so on?
Absolutely. You know, one of the things I actually like is not so much where disability is spoken about, but where it goes unspoken. You think, for example, of Charles Ruff, the top attorney in the White House, is a person who uses a wheelchair. It's not talked about, but you see him on television, and simply the fact of the absolute highest-ranking attorney in the White House being a person with a disability, I think speaks very strongly about the level of integration, that you don't necessarily need to draw attention to it. And you know, I can speak from my own experience. I'm fairly new here, just about 8 months. I joined many different domestic policy council meetings, National Economic Council meetings, and I won't take the time to go through all of the initiatives in the past few months, but we really are working awfully hard. Bob did refer to a very real problem of trying to keep within cost restraints. We have, in the last few years, commitments to a balanced budget. And while that's been very important and effective, it does place restraints. And there are a lot of things that take great economic commitments, and we need to be strategic and creative in how to meet those.
Well, I guess the issue from that standpoint is how you set priorities. And with the kind of leadership that you're providing and that which Bob is providing, and we had the opportunity to meet Judy Heumann and Kate Seelman and other people with disabilities in prominent roles in the administration, then we can only assume and hope that those priorities for people with disabilities are falling out near the top when those difficult choices are made. And you feel like that's true?
Absolutely. There really are an amazing number of people with disabilities in fairly high-level places in this administration as part of the president's overall commitment to making the administration look like America. And there's a lot of power simply in being in the room and part of the discussions.
Bob, it wasn't too many years ago that you and I might have been appointed to a position, but it was more honorary than substantive. And when the real meetings went on, we weren't invited, but when the pictures were taken, we were always there. Do you think that's changed dramatically?
Yeah,
I think that the access to meetings where decision-making affecting Americans with disabilities has never been better.
And I'd like to add a comment to that, too. You know, one of the things I think sometimes we all can get caught in is thinking that the only place where people with disabilities can make a difference is in areas directly related to disability. One of the things that I've really been working on is trying to be responsive to the comments of the disability community, to be mainstream and integrated. So we have a tremendous amount of responsibility in the White House to do our best to integrate disability. I also want to challenge the disability community to look for ways to draw linkages with other aspects of major domestic policy and unite with other groups that have similar interests. Al Gore, when he accepted the task force report that I know you worked on, said something to the effect of, it's not just the size of the feast, but how many people we can fit around the table. And I think that's a real opportunity to think about collaborative efforts for us to join hands in taking part in the diversity of American society.
Well, in large part, the progress that we've made recently is a function of the roles that both of you have played and other colleagues, not only here in Washington, but people with disabilities who have assumed responsibility, used their talents, chosen to work in disability policy areas, in state houses, with local public officials, in county offices. And it's also a function of the fact that you have not only your own positions, but you have literally millions of people with disabilities, family members and other advocates in the United States now who are helping you, supporting you. I mean, does it feel like you have a constituency behind you when you're doing these important jobs?
Probably one of the most enjoyable things in my job has been the relationships I've formed with people both in the administration and throughout the disability community. And I think it's so crucial to remember that there's no one role that is the magic bullet or the silver bullet to make things happen, that we need people on the outside in the state governments, the federal government, advocacy roles, the media, corporations. It really takes everybody to move things forward.
I want to thank both of you for being our guest here on Focus on Abilities today. Bob Williams, the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Bob, congratulations on a great job that you're doing. And I guarantee you there's a lot of people out there who are supporting you and encouraging you and willing to do whatever's necessary to provide real choice in terms of options in the community. And Jonathan Young, Office of Public Liaison, Disability Outreach official in the White House, thank you for the work that you're doing. I think it's important for people to know that Jonathan works from before I get up in the morning till way after I go to sleep. I've had exchanged phone messages with him in the middle of the night and early in the morning. And Jonathan, take care of yourself, buddy. We need you.
Thanks, Lex, and thank you. I've learned so much from you going back to my writing of the ADA, and it's a pleasure to join you again today.
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us here on Focus on Abilities. We're at the White House. We're with Bob Williams and Jonathan Young, two of the distinguished people with disabilities who are also distinguished public officials in Washington, D.C. We're on location, and thanks to the Municipal Channel and ILRU, we're able to bring you this special edition of Focus on Abilities. Please join us next time.